Hello and welcome to the CIH podcast. I'm Dr Eve Blezard, Policy Lead at the Chartered Institute of Housing, and my brief covers building safety, asset management and housing culture. In today's episode, we are exploring a little bit around the government's formal response to Grenfell Tower Inquiry, but what we are doing is taking a more practical look at fire safety in the sector, and what we really want to explore is how it can no longer be seen as just this sort of specialist function that sits on its own, but how do we fully embed fire and building safety into housing management across the board? And to do that, I'm joined by three brilliant guests today. So I'm joined by Jan Taranczuk, experienced housing professional and Vice Chair of the London and South East Fire Safety Network, Chloe Gallagher, Building Safety Manager at Magna Housing, and Gemma Darville, Head of Safety, Risk and Assurance at Gentoo. So we're going to be exploring how you embed safety into housing management, how you look at engaging residents more meaningfully, and then how do you support staff around that with the right training and confidence, but then also having a little look at how you sort of get ready and prepare for regulation under the new safety and quality standards. So I think to sort of open in terms of where people are, I think if we bring it back to where people are in terms of, not necessarily in terms of Grenfell as an event itself, but in terms of all the learning that's come from that, and particularly the more recent sort of government response to that. So my first question to everyone would be, what do you think have been the biggest shifts in how we understand not just fire safety, but fire safety as part of housing management? And then from that, what do you guys still think needs to change going forward?
I'm happy to start with that one. So thank you, Eve. So I think obviously it's been almost 8 years since the Grenfell Tower tragedy, and there's been lots of different changes. You know, we've had a whole new regulatory framework that we need to follow as social housing providers, the implementation of the Building Safety Act, different fire safety legislation that really focuses on improving customer safety. So things around fire door checks, increased inspections of fire safety equipment, you know, different recommendations across all sizes of buildings as well. So not just high rise, so looking at your over 18 metres as well. And I think there's been a lot of change, not just affecting fire safety professionals in social housing. So the implementation of the Social Housing Regulation Act and the new consumer standards has really put that focus on making sure that we know and understand our customers, we know and understand the risks to them, and that we really take steps to make sure that they are safe. So I think that's, you know, that whole shift in regulatory landscape has been one of the biggest significant changes that we've all had to work together on to really implement and make sure that customer safety is absolutely at the centre of everything that we do.
And just following on from that, I would say that the learning from the fire in London, in Camberwell in 2009, which resulted in the inquest report, the inquest in 2013, which then resulted in the coroner giving some specific recommendations. It was quite clear and has been well publicised that the recommendations from that inquest that came out in May 2013, actually most people didn't take much notice of. And much of what was learnt, or what should have been learnt from there, is as relevant today as it was when it came out. And perhaps we'll touch on some of that, on some of those aspects later during the course of the podcast, because most of those aspects that came out from the Lakanal House fire actually specifically relates to actions that housing managers can take rather than building safety experts can take.
And I think, yeah, you've both just highlighted the whole point in all of the new regulation, that we all had a tendency to put something in a box, fire safety, there it was over in the corner. And it just doesn't work like that. It's dangerous for it to work like that. So I think the biggest shift would be bringing fire safety to the forefront, what this whole podcast is about embedding it in everyday housing management, how it's everyone's responsibility.
Absolutely, Chloe. And in fact, I think given that I'm oldest by far on the podcast, in the days when I was a chief officer with the London Borough over 25 years ago, fire safety didn't occur as a subject in any executive team meeting in any shape or form, because what happened if there was a fire in the tower block, the fire brigade turned up, put the fire out and went away again. And we as a landlord in many occasions didn't know about the fire until the caretaker the following morning discovered all the burnt refuse outside the building where the fire had occurred. So that shift from awareness to doing something about it, I think is the major part, and is an important part and a positive part of what's happened since Grenfell.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it's that culture change, isn't it? It's not just the fire safety teams that are doing it, and it's an absolute journey. I think, Eve, you asked, where else have we still got to focus? And I think even 8 years on, that culture journey is still ongoing, but I definitely see a lot of change where people actually now start to see fire safety as part of the day-to-day housing management, and not just this bolt-on, as Chloe said, in a box. It's something that is starting to become part of everybody's responsibility, and I think that's where we've really got work to do to make sure that that continues.
And indeed, that also follows on from the important role of housing management, and where in many cases now social landlords are going back to smaller patch sizes, where people can actually speak to their residents and have time to speak to their residents, because the fire safety aspect is as important as safeguarding. For instance, the practical knowledge of a housing manager or housing officer going into a property and noticing that the bathroom door has been smashed in will set off alarm bells from a domestic abuse perspective, and that same observation then needs to be applied to fire safety issues around basic stuff about smoking and electrical safety, so that information can be shared with other members of the teams within the organisation, so that something can be done about it.
So just sort of picking up on there, on the theme that we've got there about, really working hard to make fire safety part of everyday housing management. So it was just to have a look at how you were actually doing that yourselves in practice. So how is fire safety now more part of your everyday housing management, or at least how are you pushing for that to be, and maybe some examples about how you're working with other teams outside maybe building and fire safety in your organisation, and what that looks like, what you've learned from that, maybe even some of the challenges around that.
So just going off what Jan said regarding embedding it into everyday functions, I think housing officers or sheltered housing advisors would go out and they've got a long list of things they need to do in their role, in their housing management role, that fire safety wasn't really sort of on that radar. We were finding they were going out to look at hoarding or property condition workflows, but there just wasn't that knowledge or that confidence that hoarding can then be a fire safety issue. Does this person need a person-centered fire risk assessment? What can we do about this? We've had estate operatives. They are the eyes and ears, estate operatives and cleaners. I can't say it enough. They are in our buildings all the time, but if they don't have the knowledge or the confidence or the experience to know what they're looking for, then that can't necessarily be fed back. So our estates officers are now estates and compliance officers. They've gone through training, they're doing the weekly testing, they know what they're looking for, they know about keeping the communal areas sterile, they know what to look for in a fire door. Our housing officers, they have been given extensive training by myself in regards to person-centered fire risk assessments, what you're looking for, what alarm bell should be ringing when you might be there for another housing function, but you should start thinking about the customer safety journey as well. And it's impacted, to be fair, quite a lot of what we've done. It's helped gas checks, EICRs, it can sometimes help tackle antisocial behaviour. So I think it all loops round. It isn't just building safety, oh, another thing we've got to do. Actually, we found it helps other areas of the business or the house and officer's job. So yeah, that's probably what our focus has been on: education, training, and just giving people confidence in what they're doing and why they're doing it.
I agree with what Chloe said there as well. We've took a very similar approach around really building up that culture of ownership and accountability to our housing teams, trades colleagues who are out and about in our customers' homes. We've done a lot of training with people, and we also have something which we call an SNQR, which is something not quite right. And we've used this for a long time. And that's something which people can access either on their handheld or by their mobile phone. And if just something doesn't look quite right, they can submit it. It'll go to a team who can review and look at, right, what support does this customer need? And, you know, from a fire safety perspective, it can be very much around hoarding or poor smoking behaviours. And we can look to work with these customers. We can look to work with the fire and rescue service around how we can really support to make it safer. In addition to that, what we also introduced post Grenfell was our housing teams now do quarterly inspections of communal areas as well. So that was around how do we educate and really get that ownership. So when people are walking through, they're looking at cleaning standards, they're looking at kind of your typical tenancy management issues, but really embedding fire safety into that as well. Is there a damaged door? Is there something blocking an escape route? And making real clear, easy routes for that to be reported, because our housing managers have a really busy, difficult job. You know, they have got big patch sizes, and, you know, we are looking to make those smaller. And that really helps with around, you know, knowing and understanding customers. But they have got really busy jobs. And I think the easier we can make it for people to report things, for people to really take that action rather than just walk by. As fire safety professionals, that's what we want to do. We want to make it as easy as possible for people who are out and about to really embed fire safety into their everyday jobs.
And the reality is that fire safety actually is something that we're all should be taking care of with our own lives. And the point I've made to a number of people that it doesn't require staff to be trained into fire safety, because fire safety is something they should be doing at home. It's the basic knowledge and being able to have the confidence to share it with residents. And in simple things, for instance, like the fact that children under the age of 10 are unlikely to be able to hear the noise of a smoke alarm. At the point, this is being recorded a couple of months ago in Brighton at the Brighton conference, to an audience of 80 people. I made that point, and very few people in the audience actually knew that children can't hear the noise of a smoke alarm. And that kind of basic information in a conversation with a parent quite often will then lead to other information that can be useful to the housing organisation to understand exactly what's going on in that person's home. And it's that sharing of information that in the end, I think, leads to a safer home behind the front door, because as we know, the majority of fires happen behind the front door, and that the figures in terms of fire deaths isn't actually going down. In fact, since the Building Safety Act came into operation, ironically, fire deaths have actually gone up.
I think one of the challenges that we have around that, Jan, is a lot of people, or certainly in our organisation when they were having that first sort of time training, we still have the challenge of fear of people getting it wrong, because they do see these coroner reports, you do see the news headlines, everyone's heard of Grenfell. And you hear it time and time again, you know, I'm not a fire safety professional, I wouldn't know that, that's not my job. So real education, and like Gemma said, reshaping a culture. It's not going away. Let's get you up to speed. Let's get you confident so we can continue to deliver a first-class service. And now that first-class service does include fire safety. What can we do to make you safer in your home? So I think, you know, even as an organisation, we've taken that right back now to employee inductions. When someone's coming into the business who are going to be part of a frontline team, then it's captured then. And like you said, we've made changes to workloads to facilitate those tasks. There's been new regional models for the way housing is done, so it's all split down, and it is that getting to know people and customers getting to know you. Some of this stuff is a really long process. You know, customers with hoarding, that might take 6, 7, 8 months before they even let you in the door, before that you've got that level of trust. So yeah, these things take time, and I think just building people's confidence that you're not going to get it wrong. You know, we need to do something.
And well, certainly that's I think an excellent welcome news. But just out of curiosity, Chloe, you talked about new staff. What about new tenants? How are new tenants treated with regard to fire safety within Magna?
So it depends what area they're going into. General needs, sheltered housing is slightly different, but you know, they all receive their section 156 information, they all receive their fire action plan, they all receive infographics, information around fire safety that's relevant to the building that they're moving in. And some of them we will then go out and see. We will have coffee mornings. We will talk about the fire action plan. We'll talk about how their building keeps them safe. We've got a new extra care unit up in Gallagher. It's all singing, all dancing, and I spent a couple of hours with the customers the other morning just talking about how their building keeps them safe, because some of them are really quite vulnerable, and it was just understanding that, yes, while this is your action plan and this is what we do if there's a fire, the likelihood of a fire happening or of being allowed to grow because the way your building's been designed is quite small. And they were quite happy with that. They sort of walked away understanding more about why we do, what they've got in their building. So I guess engagement across all areas, from coming in and throughout their tenancies with us.
I think, as well as what Chloe's talking about, and obviously we've touched quite a lot on frontline housing management, I also think the integration of fire safety into other core housing functions has improved as well. So things like planned investment work, so thinking about fire safety not as a bolt onto that, but actually thinking about fire door replacement programmes, retrofitting sprinklers, the need to look at compartmentation when the investment work is ongoing. So I think that has been a positive as well. You know, looking at repairs and maintenance to think, where do we really need to integrate fire safety measures? Because I think historically it has been a bolt on. You know, you'd think about this is the new kitchens, new bathrooms, that type of investment work that needs to be done. But actually now thinking about that holistically as the building, to think what fire safety measures have we got in here and where do we need to improve? So I think that's also been something that is now starting to be integrated into those kind of core housing functions that we all deliver.
And out of curiosity, Gemma, how does that relate to your reactive repairs contractors, about whether that information, how confident are you that they know what they shouldn't be doing with regard to knocking holes in things and leaving things left, if you like?
Yes, I think that's a real challenge, isn't it, in social housing, around managing contractors and what they are and aren't doing. So at Gentoo, we do an induction with any of our contractors specific to fire safety. We include further detail if they're working in our high-rise buildings, but we also have a permit to work process in place as well. So if anybody's going to be doing any sort of intrusive work within a communal area, they need to get a permit to work, which has a follow-up part to it that looks at, have you drilled anything? You know, it could be putting in your electrical cable in, any sort of breaking into the walls, and a follow-up part to say what fire stopping work is needed, who's the competent person that's going to do it, have we got the certificate to confirm that it's been done to the right standard. So we have that follow-up loop. But in reality, that is difficult to manage, and that relies on lots of people doing the right thing, because a permit to work system across social housing is quite spread out across different managers who are managing different types of work. So that education and really getting people on board with that is really important to make sure that that happens.
And I think Chloe's had an experience of this recently as well. The thing we can't control from housing management at the minute is people dealing with fibre optics and broadband, and that's an issue for everybody, isn't it?
Yeah, I think everyone who is listening to this podcast who manages a building, probably nodding their head at that point. We've just spoken about, it's going to get worse with the fibre rollout. So what can we do? And again, it comes down to education. So we're going to write to all of our blocks of flats. We're going to make it into a permissions procedure, although we're not going to say no. We figure calling it a permissions procedure rather than notifying us. Will have a better effect. It's going to have a standard, yes, of course you can do it, here are the terms. And then we will then have the data behind where this stuff has gone, so we can follow it up, we can quality check it, because I've seen the health and safety plans and what their subcontractors are meant to be working to, and then obviously the reality out on our site. So yeah, constant challenge.
So thank you for that. There was quite a bit in there. We touched a little bit there on resident engagement, which we are going to come back to, but and it was really powerful hearing sort of the difference you've made and the different approaches in sort of embedding that sort of attitude that fire safety is part of housing management. And we did touch a little bit there on sort of like contractors, and then maybe much more complex cases when it comes to hoarding. And that leads me to the fact that, of course, we don't just work on our own, and we often have to work with wider organisations and different types of organisations, particularly if we want to look at fire safety sort of really holistically. So it was just to look at how you're working with those external partners, particularly in terms of how you're working with local fire and rescue services or other key sort of partner agencies, and how does that tie in with a sort of resident person-centered sort of assessment approach, and just tell me a little bit more about your cross-organisational working, and then we'll have a look at residents.
If I kick off first, because obviously I'm not working for any specific organisation for the moment, so my colleagues can come in afterwards. If I just speak generally for the minute, and that is my concern around, obviously both organisations represented here today have properties in different areas of fire and rescue services in the first place. Magna more, I suspect, more than Gentoo. So there's the challenge of different fire and rescue services doing things differently. That's the first thing. And then, of course, adult services, the local social services departments, are also under enormous strain and doing things differently. And we've talked about learning from Grenfell, and people listening to this podcast will know that I can bore for England on coroner's reports. But my greatest concern at the moment is coroner's reports that identify the lack of communication between either a hospital discharging a patient, and I hate the phrase discharge, letting a patient home, and then the link between the fire and rescue service and possibly the landlord, and then the care provider. That really is an issue that has yet to be properly addressed, and housing managers potentially can be caught in the middle of that, while something quite dangerous is happening with regard to the people actually living in the property. So I'll also be interested to hear what's currently going on from a practical perspective with Magna and Gentoo.
So at Gentoo, we do a lot of work with the fire and rescue service, and actually we're quite lucky here at Gentoo that we only work with one fire and rescue service, so we're not split across multiple authorities. We've worked really closely with our Tyne and Wear Fire and Rescue Service for a long time. We have monthly meetings where we can catch up and we can share information around any of the changing risks in our buildings, but also we can talk about any particular challenges they can support us with. We make a lot of safe and well referrals to the Fire and Rescue Service. So if we do identify issues of hoarding behaviour, yes, there is other adult safeguarding services we can support with, but actually with that actual fire safety behaviours and things, we can do a safe and well referral. We obviously we've set up systems so we can let the fire and rescue service know if we've got any fire safety systems that are going to be out of use for over 24 hours, so we can keep them up to date with that. We share secure information links for our person-centred fire risk assessment information. So we will provide all of that so it's live and up to date all of the time with the fire and rescue service, as well as being physically available in the red premises information box in our high-rise sheltered and extra care schemes as well. I think another way that we really partner with them is we also carry out exercises with them. So we did one recently where it was an exercise, and this really involved our frontline housing teams as well, of how would we respond as Gentoo in an emergency. So the fire and rescue service filled one of the basements of our high-rise with cosmetic smoke. They went in and tested their practices for getting water to the building. How would they, where would they park, or how would they gain access? But also, what should we do? So what if we're responding to that, potentially could be out of hours, could be any time. What do we need to do? What response do we need to have on the scene? How do we work really closely with the commanders from the fire and rescue service? So we're not in their way, but we're providing that support, that we know how we would quickly access customer information, next of kin information. Where would we put our customers if we needed to evacuate the building? Have we got all of that set up? So that's really led us to develop some really good major incident and incident management plans, toolkits, information that can be quickly accessed during an incident, so that we can really make sure that customers are at the heart of that incident response, but also we know how we could work really well with the fire and rescue service as well.
Yeah, we did something very similar, Gemma, with Dorset and Wiltshire. Dorset and Wiltshire, we don't have probably as many high rises as you guys do up there. But they came and did an exercise at our high rise, and they were allowed to charge their hoses. So they were carrying 4 hoses up to the fourth floor. And that was really valuable. I think, like you said, it showed us where we needed to improve. It was lessons learnt from us, but also for them, they said it was a unique experience, something that they wouldn't necessarily be able to deliver. And they went away with so many lessons learned. Some of the officers that came were in their training, they hadn't long been with the service, some were more experienced, and for them, I think their biggest lesson learnt was around communication and how they're communicating to each other during an incident. I mean, even for us, as simple as in our high rise, you get down to level 1, obviously all the wayfinding signage is up. Level 1 is ground level, whereas ground is car park, and the fire service continue to try and go down to the car park. So it highlighted for us we needed a sign on that wall saying exit to the main. And even just small things like that you don't necessarily think of, your wayfinding signage is all in, all correct, but just that little thing that could help in an incident. We have primary authority with Dorset and Wiltshire. We also have Devon and Somerset, who we don't have a primary authority with. Our relationship with Dorset and Wiltshire, like Jan says, is a little bit different than it is with Devon. We do find that they do things differently, but it is an invaluable partnership, and I would encourage anybody to go into primary authority partnerships, because like Gemma says, we have the monthly meetings, we share about false alarms. We can share, we get very often referrals. South West Ambulance will refer to Dorset and Wiltshire, who will then, we've now got it, that they will then come and let us know that they've had a referral. So there's that link that you were saying, Jan, was missing. We're sort of closing the gap on that. We've decided to take all of the installation of smoke alarms and hard of hearing kits that the fire service would normally put in. We've taken that off their hands. They will tell us and we will do it within 48 hours. We don't get very many of them because we're usually pretty on top of that. But that way we can manage it. We can manage that they're hardwired installs, that they're linked to carbon monoxide detectors, that the hard of hearing kits we know about, we can test them, we can maintain them. And that partnership with them is just working really, really well. Like I said, I think it's invaluable.
And I have to say that's really refreshing to learn, Chloe, because 2 recent coroner's reports showed that the relationship between the local fire service and people providing care and services to a resident was severely lacking. Now, it so happens that one of those issues that I'm currently pursuing is the fact that we as social landlords don't actually know how many people die in our properties. Of the 190 people that died last year in a fire, there is no statistic that tells us just where those people were. There was some analysis done a few years ago by the Home Office that showed about 40% of fire deaths occur in our properties. But the challenge, and I've been making this point elsewhere, the challenge for us to reduce fire deaths has to be tempered with the fact that we need to know where the deaths occur in the first place. And I think the relationship you've got with your fire services, and perhaps we can talk a little bit about what primary authority means for listeners so they understand it a bit more. But the relationship that you have with the fire services is really important, because clearly if something untoward is happening, you have a relationship that says they can come and talk to you. A little bit more challenging for housing managers working for an Orbit or Places for People or a more national organisation where they are dealing with literally dozens of different organisations. But that still has to be embedded somewhere, because we'll never reduce the number of people dying in fires if we don't actually know where they are. And if I can just for the minute, just go back to those two coroner's reports. One of the issues was that it was the London Fire Brigade actually had a policy that they would undertake a home visit, a home safety visit, but they would give the results of that information to the client if the client was able to understand the information. So you had a situation where the client was bedbound, but was fully aware of what was going on. She was given the information, but the fire service didn't give that information either to the local didn't give that information to either the care company or the local authority or the adult services. So when things went wrong, they didn't even know that the fire service had been to do that home visit. But it sounds as though that the relationship you two have got with your local fire services just wouldn't happen in your areas, would it?
I'd like to think not. Like I say, we talk regularly. We know all of the Safe and Well advisors. They actually, the other week, we were talking about where I might get into a customer's home and I'm like, say you should have a Safe and Well. They don't want one, but they need some fire-proof bedding or their carpet sprayed because of poor smoking behaviours. So we've worked with Dorset and Wiltshire. They've now come up with, I think they call it doorstop advice. So don't need consent for a Safe and Well. They will go to the property, either with the housing officer, Sheltered Housing Advisor, myself, knock, see if they can have a conversation at the door. If the customer's still pretty shut down, not open to it, they will still leave the products with that customer there and then, because for the listeners, in case they're not aware, you have to consent to a Safe and Well. So I can't make a referral if someone's point blank told me, no, I don't want them in my home. So engagement can be quite difficult with customers, but I think this new step will also help those people who don't want to engage or might trust their housing officer. So if the housing officer is present, they might get further than if the fire service went on their own. So again, it's just that partnership.
That sounds like a really good initiative, certainly one that I might speak with our fire and rescue service as well. We do a lot of partnership work with them. One recent example is we have been looking to tackle e-bike fires across our high-rise. So we developed an initiative working with the fire and rescue service and a local mobility specialist, where we've been going, so we did a survey who has an e-bike, e-scooter, mobility scooter, so anything with a lithium battery, in any of our high-rise buildings. And we've then been going around and doing health checks, which are funded by Gentoo, to look at what's the condition of these now, looking at the charges, looking at whereabouts people are storing and charging these vehicles. Is it in an escape route? And sometimes, Chloe, I don't know if you find the same, but sometimes by taking somebody from the fire and rescue service with you into the customers' homes, it just seems to have that impact and that presence of actually, we can talk about it, we can say the same things to our customers. And sometimes that having that relationship with customers from a housing perspective is really good for getting in the front door. But what we find is actually taking somebody from the fire and rescue service, they're there in their uniform, and actually it just has that different impact where the customer will listen and think, this is a voice of authority, I really need to do that. So we find that joint partnership gives us everything in terms of doing that.
And that leads us on really well into how you've you've talked about there about really understanding what good partnership working can look like when it's done well, and maintaining those relationships with not just fire and rescue, as you just said there, you know, with mobility service, social care, whoever it may be. But you both touched on the part where maybe it's the relationship that the housing has with the resident that has the trust element that is really, really important. So it was just to build on that. You'd started a little bit there in terms of engaging with fire and rescue with residents, but it was just understanding how do you communicate around that with residents, in not just in a way that they can trust, but also in a way that makes sense to them, that they understand and they get that. And so it's just to expand a little bit more on your resident engagement. You know, what does that look like? Not just engagement either, but in terms of education. We've talked a little bit about awareness and behaviour, so just picking up on that. What does that look like?
So for us here at Gentoo, I think Chloe mentioned earlier about, you know, different building types, different customers living in different building types, from your sheltered and extra care, your general needs housing, your high-rise buildings. So for us, the engagement starts at really understanding that demographic of customers who live in the buildings. What is their preferred means of communication? We've done a lot of work on this, certainly around our high-rise, and then looking to roll out further across our sheltered extra care and other blocks of flats. But really understanding who lives in there, you know, what's the best time to contact people? Will people be out at work? Are people in during the day? Do we have email addresses, mobile phone numbers? So would we get a better response from text surveys and email surveys, or actually in particular buildings, face-to-face and traditional style notice boards work really well? People will in multi-occupied buildings have their own networks, so things like resident groups that have been formed informally. So trying to really get to understand who leads them, because actually you could have 50 conversations with people and it not really get anywhere, or you could speak to that one person who leads the resident engagement for that building in terms of, you know, they have the coffee mornings, they have people's ear, and actually understanding who are those really influential people in certain buildings, we found has really helped us, because you kind of get them on board, you do some education, some work with them, and it really opens doors in those buildings to really get messages out to the rest of customers. So I think definitely that understanding who lives in the building, understanding customers' needs and communication needs. And then we've got a range of different ways that we then tackle that. So things like easy read guides, evacuation videos, lots of different, we've done fridge magnets of evacuation strategies, and we'll just say, you know, pop this on the fridge because, you know, it's in a visible place. I know other people's done things with like door hangers. So just thinking of those ways that you can get messages into the everyday, so people start to really, you know, it embeds and people start to understand what the safety features are of the building, what they'd need to do in an emergency. So I think that really tailored approach is very, very important.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, Gentoo are the experts. I sit on there. Is it monthly, quarterly?
Quarterly.
Yeah, customer engagement webinar or groups. We all sort of get together and talk about what everyone else is doing, really, and exactly that, like the fridge magnets. I thought that was such a good idea, so simple. I went out and ordered 1,000.
Oh, excellent.
So, you know, just sharing that information as well is valuable. And like Gemma says, we do the coffee mornings. We've got videos, fridge magnets. We've got letters, we've got British Sign Language interpreters that can come with us. We've got just knowing the demographic of customers in your building can considerably change how you engage with people, and just making it sort of more relevant. We use a lot of our own statistics with customers. So we record obviously all the fire incidents every year. I think last year we had 23. We do a lessons learned, a little bit of a report from it to see where the areas are. Most of them were kitchen fires, and most of them were forgetfulness, putting the tea towel on the hob, or leaving the pizza box on the hob, falling asleep with the dinner in the oven. But when we talk to customers about that, this has actually happened to our customers, this is real, this isn't a statistic, this isn't on the news, that can also be really quite helpful. I mean, the amount of customers that have said, oh, my mobility scooter isn't dangerous. There's not been any fires with lithium batteries. And, you know, electrical safety first, I've got a really powerful video. It probably does need to come with a bit of a trigger warning about a young chap that lost his 2 young daughters and his wife in a fire because of an e-bike. And, you know, sometimes I will show them that because that is what is needed. So yeah, it's like Gemma said, that real tailored approach to resident engagement.
I think that sharing across the sector is so important as well, because we're all trying to do the same thing. We're certainly not in competition, and the group Chloe referred to there would at Gentoo would set up a group, just meet on Teams every quarter, but really focusing on the resident engagement side of fire safety and building safety. And I think we've all learned a lot from each other, Chloe, haven't we? And we continue to do so. And it's not about reinventing the wheel, you know, people sharing their experiences of what works or what hasn't worked or what's been a real challenge. And it's certainly more of what the sector needs. You know, we are all trying to do the same thing around keeping our customers safe. So that's something where I've found the collaboration across the sector is really good on this type of thing.
Absolutely. I have to say it's heartening to listen to the peer review, because I've been banging on about this for years. So I'm really pleased to see that it's actually happening, because that whole point about sharing information about events is really important, because it's the same as the gas safety issue. I mean, you two haven't been around the industry long enough to remember the introduction of the regulations, I suspect, in 1988, when I think since then we've managed to, touch wood, get gas safety as an issue to be understood by the vast majority of our residents, although I accept that still it's difficult to get in. But that issue about always reminding people about gas safety comes back to always reminding people about fire safety, because it's not fire safety isn't an incident, it's a process that has to be continually banged on about, and it's refreshed by the information that Chloe mentioned about looking at the fires that have occurred in the property. And I suspect many people listening to this podcast won't know how many fires have occurred in their properties in the last 12 months. And if they don't, it will be a good opportunity for them to go and find out, because sharing that information and sharing the reality of things going wrong is the way that ultimately we're going to save people's lives. And I think that's the main, I think, takeaway from a discussion around fire safety. I'd make the point earlier in another place that if Octavia Hill was still around, she would be insistent on her staff knowing about fire safety, because if people don't die in fires, then they're able to pay their rent, to be blunt, and that's the whole point of keeping the service going, isn't it? So that continual sharing information, and I think the CIH can in doing this particular podcast, and in the future, the CIH has got a role in promoting the sharing of information amongst housing professionals, because it's really, really important.
Yeah, and that was something I really sort of picked up there between the two of you, that very sort of natural sort of way in which you shared. And I think you were saying then, Gemma, not necessarily reinventing the wheel, you know, but learning about, you know, real practical changes, and often quite simple changes or simple framing that really make a difference. And yeah, just to pick up on that from a CIH point of view, there are lots of events and conferences out there, and sometimes I think maybe there's a challenge in terms of residents understanding why we need so many of them. But I think when we're all sort of maybe working a little bit more remotely and at home, sometimes you need that very human engagement to flesh things out and understand, oh right, okay, that's how that works, and that's what we do. And then I suppose in the vein of sort of learning, some of the things I think listeners will be very keen to hear from you is what would be, out of everything we've talked about, what would be your take on preparing for regulation, and especially in terms of how we look at fire safety, maybe under the safety and quality standard, and from anyone that has any recent real life experiences of preparing for that regulation, if they would like to share their their thoughts on that, that would be great.
Yes, Eve. So here at Gentoo, last year we went through a routine planned inspection, and we're one of the first housing organisations to actually receive a C1 grading for the consumer standards, so something that we're really proud of here at Gentoo. But absolutely how we manage fire safety is part of that. And if you look at a lot of the regulatory judgments that are published by the Regulator of Social Housing, you see that many councils and housing associations who've been awarded a C3 grading, fire safety or poor fire safety management has actually contributed to that. So there's a lot of judgments that talk about outstanding remedial actions or outstanding fire and overdue fire risk assessments. So I think in terms of preparing for it, it's really, really important to know and understand your properties, know and understand where you're the responsible person as the landlord under the fire safety order, and really making sure that you have a good handle on that data. So knowing where you need to do your fire risk assessment, making sure that you have an in-date fire risk assessment, and if not, why not? And making sure the management of remedial actions is really good. And that's something historically here at Gentoo that we have had to improve on. Going back quite a few years now, we had a lot of remedial actions and we had to develop really robust management systems, processes. And I think that's something that's really important, is having really clear and really good management systems, oversight of it, and really good reporting on that. So you're very, very clear on what your position is on fire safety. I think on the other side of that, so it's knowing and understanding your properties where you're the responsible person. But if you own properties that are managed by others, so you're not under fire safety legislation the responsible person, it's still having that oversight of those properties if you own them. Who is the responsible person? Are they doing all of the fire safety checks, fire risk assessments, things that they need to do? And I think the introduction of the TSMs is something where now we need to report that as one of our management information measures. So if we have properties, even if we own but don't manage them, we need to make sure that we're reporting that there is a valid fire risk assessment for them. So I think there's a number of different ways now through the introduction of the Social Housing Regulation Act that actually it's starting to make sure fire safety is embedded throughout everything that we do.
Let me come in at this point, because I think that's obviously very, very important. But from a fire safety perspective, from a housing manager's perspective, the issue remains that the TSMs don't actually measure fire safety. They measure whether or not fire safety risk assessments have been done, and the issue around remedial actions is important. But going back to, and I'm sorry to be boring about this, but going back to Lakanal, what happened immediately after Lakanal House, and this I'm talking about 2009, 2010, what happened was that there was an immediate understanding by both the fire service and us in housing that people didn't know enough about the regulatory reform order that had come in 2006. And so the CIH, in conjunction with then the Chief Fire Officers Association, organised a series of national seminars across the country and into Scotland, where, sponsored by a particular company, we were able to then share information with fire officers as well as housing officers. And as a result of that, a booklet was produced, Eve. You may want to just check back. It was produced round about 2012. The booklet actually came out with regards to good practice around fire safety. And it may well be, as a result of today, perhaps there could be further discussions about whether further information could be produced in readable form to share that information that both Gemma and Chloe have been talking about, because it remains clearly an issue that more information needs to be shared around what goes on behind the front door, and that whole issue around smoking and the fact that most fires occur in the kitchen, the reasons why those fires occur in the kitchen, remain an important point from a landlord perspective.
I think I agree, Jan, around the, especially introduction of the TSMs and how they just measure, have you got a valid fire risk assessment? And it's just a starting point around, it can't be used as a tick box exercise. Yes. This visibility and accountability for things like fire safety is just really the start of it. It can't, it doesn't demonstrate in and of itself that homes are safe from fire, but I think that increased visibility, that increased accountability for organisations to actually report on that they have to know and understand their data, and there is less places to hide if you don't know and understand your fire safety data now. So I think it's definitely a journey, and you are absolutely correct. You know, the TSMs are not going to change things drastically, but I think it increases that accountability, and it is a step forward from where we were.
No, I agree with you entirely.
And I would just say, just to add on what you both said, I don't think organisations should be, scared is the right word, worried. We do not have it all. We don't have it all right. We're all learning from each other. So started last week, Magna are just putting themselves, not self-audit, we have an external company, but we call audits upon ourselves, and we're currently going through one now with our adherence to the fire safety regulations. And I'm sure there will things come out of that we need to improve on. But if you're not learning and you're not improving, then when you do have the regulator come knocking, like Gemma said, you might get a bit of a surprise. So don't wait for these things. Start doing your
scrutinising your data is really important, isn't it? So you know and understand it yourself, and where you can improve and learn lessons.
Yeah, definitely.
Brilliant. And I think we're sort of coming to wrapping up our discussion today. So what I would ask is, if we had a final thought and you had to pin it down to what is one practical sort of change or approach that you think listeners should take away from today, can I try and pin you down to one thing?
If I can go first.
Of course.
It ties into what Gemma has already said and what Chloe has said with regards to working with the local fire and rescue service. And lessons that have come out of Grenfell from a practical perspective that came out of the first report in relation to how Kensington and Chelsea TMO was unable to respond positively to all sorts of things when the fire first occurred, go back to what happened at Lacanau. And all of those things are very basic things, like knowing where you're going to put residents in the event of a major emergency, who's actually got access to the information on the computer, because Kensington and Chelsea had major problems with regards to that. A whole range of practical things that can only be identified if you have a practice run of the event itself. So I would urge that anybody who hasn't already done it should take the Lacanau House recommendations and some of the recommendations that came out of Grenfell, for instance, initially the ones I've talked about, where the main gas valve is to turn the gas off to a building, and where access to the water is. If they could go through a list of those things, and then on a regular basis just have an internal audit to check that all the things that came out of those previous events are actually being dealt with. And perhaps, Eve, I'm happy to work with you over the next couple of months to produce a document that the CIH could produce that summarises all of those, that would become I hate the word checklist, because we've agreed that we don't need checklists, but an aide memoir for things that people should be looking at on a regular basis. And I'm happy to work on that with you.
Yeah, and we've probably taken quite a practical provider approach throughout this podcast, just to pick up on that I'm relatively new to my policy brief, and a big part of that is now making sure that we have the right resources for members in this area, but also because it's a lot of the big issues remain, but then there's still a lot of quite fast-paced change. So yeah, it's making sure that what we do have is up to date and relevant, and I'm very grateful for Jan's advice on that. Did anyone else want to sort of, Gemma or Chloe, did you want to try and sum up one key takeaway for listeners today?
It's difficult. It's difficult to have one. I would probably say keep working laterally across your businesses, just on that education and training, especially frontline service delivery. It's an ongoing reshaping of culture across it all. And leading on to that, although I know it's sort of point 2, is data. Good data feeds everything that you do. the better the data, the better the management, the better the service. So sort of data and working laterally across your business.
I think for me, I agree with both Jan and Chloe's takeaways. And probably for me, the biggest thing is that continued culture change. Fire safety is everybody's responsibility every day. But I think what we need to do is, to echo Jan's point, is we need to give people these clear toolkits, aid memoirs. We need to make it as easy and as simple for people to do this and to embed it into day-to-day housing practices as possible, because people have very busy and very broad jobs across social housing. So the easier we can make it to get people on board and to help keep pushing that culture change forward, I think for me is absolutely where we need to focus.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And I'm just trying to keep up with everybody's final points there. But I think what we covered there is that we sort of maybe open with Jan reminding us that fire safety isn't just about that tick box, that compliance, and it's maybe not just having the knowledge and the systems, but maybe the confidence to act when it matters. And then I think we've covered that. How does this run right across an organisation, not just in that specialist teams? And I think we've been very, very clear about in terms of culture and data, but also in terms of maybe clarity around some of that and what we're asking frontline staff to do with some of that information. And I think the last thought there from Gemma sort of really sort of brought home that culture change, it underpins a lot of that, and that's ongoing. And maybe it's a bit ironic to say this in a podcast, but we can't just talk about these things. We need to make them achievable and doable. And I think that's where we come back to, how do we make very clear and understandable resources? Again, not the not going back to the checklist, but how do we make really accessible resources and engagement that works with staff and with residents? So how do we do that? So I think it is very difficult to try and sum it up, but I suppose if I can try and not try and sound too cheesy, that we should be making fire safety everybody's business every day, but also it's about giving people maybe that confidence and that clarity, not to be scared of fire safety because it feels and looks too technical, and that it's just part of everyday housing management, and so important that we get that right. So I'd like to thank you all for such a rich and detailed discussion, but very practical. I think there were a lot of key sort of takeaways there that listeners can really look at. And to our listeners, thank you very much to listening to the podcast. If you'd like to hear more from us, please do follow the CIH podcast on Spotify or visit our website, and we will see you next time.